They say time heals all wounds. But when I lost Sarah after 42 years of marriage, I wasn't sure any amount of time could heal the gaping hole in my heart. I'm Pastor James Wilson, and 3 years ago, my world shattered when my beloved wife passed away after her battle with cancer. I still remember standing at the pulpit that Sunday after her funeral, looking out at my congregation, the same people I'd counseled through their own grief for decades, and feeling completely hollow inside. The man who had guided others through the darkest valleys was now lost in his own wilderness of grief. I thought I'd never smile again. I thought joy had left my life forever. But I was wrong. And today, I want to share my journey with you. When Sarah first passed, I experienced what I can only describe as emotional numbness. It's like my mind couldn't process what had happened. I'd wake up reaching for her side of the bed. I'd catch myself picking up the phone to tell her something funny that happened during the day. For 42 years, every decision, every joy, every sorrow was shared. And suddenly, I was alone. The shock manifests differently for everyone. For me, it was this strange disconnect between what I knew intellectually, that Sarah was gone, and what my heart refused to accept. I'd walk into our home and call out her name before catching myself. I'd set 2 places at the dinner table out of habit. As a pastor, I'd counseled countless widows and widowers. I'd sit with them, pray with them, guide them through their grief. I thought I understood what they were going through. But until you experience that kind of loss yourself, you can't truly comprehend its depth. All my theological training, all my years of ministry, couldn't prepare me for the personal tsunami of grief. One elderly gentleman in my congregation, who'd lost his wife a decade earlier, came to me about a month after Sarah's passing. He didn't offer platitudes or tell me it would get better. He simply said, "The pain doesn't go away, Pastor James. You just build a bigger life around it." At the time, I couldn't imagine what that meant. How could life ever expand beyond this all-consuming grief? For someone who's dedicated their life to ministry, experiencing grief can create a particularly complex spiritual struggle. I found myself in the uncomfortable position of questioning the very faith I'd preached about for decades. There were nights I'd lie awake, angry at God. How could He take Sarah? Why didn't He answer our prayers for healing? These weren't just theological questions. They were the raw, aching questions of a husband who missed his wife. I'd stand at the pulpit on Sundays talking about God's love and mercy, then go home and weep, wondering where that mercy was when Sarah needed it most. I remember one particularly dark night, about 4 months after she passed. I was sitting in my study, surrounded by theological books that suddenly seemed hollow and meaningless. I opened my Bible to the Psalms, those ancient songs that don't shy away from grief and questioning, and found myself reading Psalm 88. It's perhaps the only psalm that doesn't end with hope or resolution. It ends in darkness. "You have taken from me friend and neighbor. Darkness is my closest friend." That psalm gave me permission to acknowledge the darkness I was feeling. I didn't need to pretend for God's sake. He could handle my anger, my questions, my grief. And somehow, in acknowledging the depth of my pain before God, rather than trying to spiritualize it away, I began to find Him meeting me there in the darkness. Something people don't talk about enough is how grief affects you physically. In the months following Sarah's death, I experienced what grief researchers call somatic symptoms. I had constant headaches. I couldn't sleep, then couldn't wake up. My appetite disappeared completely. I lost 20 pounds in 2 months without trying. My doctor explained that grief triggers a stress response in our bodies. The emotional pain actually manifests physically. He told me about studies showing that the risk of heart attack increases significantly in the weeks following the loss of a loved one. They call it broken heart syndrome, and it's a very real physiological response. I noticed my hands would shake when I tried to perform simple tasks like buttoning my shirt. My memory, which had always been sharp, became unreliable. I'd walk into a room and forget why I was there. I'd lose track mid-sentence while preaching. My congregation was gracious, but I felt like I was failing them. One Sunday, about 5 months after Sarah passed, I completely blanked during my sermon. I stood there, staring at my notes, unable to remember what I was saying or what came next. After what felt like an eternity of silence, I finally just said, "I'm sorry, but I'm struggling today." What happened next was remarkable. An elderly widow in the front row stood up and said, "That's okay, Pastor. We're here to carry you for a while." Then others stood, and before I knew it, the service had transformed into a beautiful time of shared grief and community support. If there's one thing I've learned through this journey, it's that people often don't know what to say to someone who's grieving. And in their discomfort, they sometimes say things that hurt more than help. "She's in a better place now. God needed another angel. At least she's not suffering anymore. You'll find someone else. It's been 6 months, aren't you feeling better yet?" These comments came from people who cared about me, who wanted to ease my pain. But they often felt like they were minimizing my loss or rushing my grief. The worst for me was, God must have needed her more than you did. I wanted to scream. No, I needed her here with me. As both someone experiencing grief and a pastor who's guided others through it, I've come to believe that the most helpful thing you can say is simply, "I'm here. I'm listening." You don't need to fix the person's pain or offer theological explanations. Just be present. One of my dearest friends, another pastor from across town, would come over every Thursday evening. Sometimes we talk about Sarah. Sometimes about church matters. Sometimes we just watch a ball game in silence. But his consistent presence was more healing than any words could have been. About 8 months after Sarah passed, I realized I needed to establish new patterns for my life. For over 4 decades, my daily rhythms had been intertwined with hers. We had our morning routine. She'd make coffee while I walked our dog. We had dinner together every night at 6:30. Sunday afternoons were for visiting grandchildren. Creating new rhythms felt like a betrayal at first, as if I was erasing her from my life. But gradually, I understood that finding new patterns wasn't about forgetting the old ones. It was about learning to live in my new reality. I started small. I joined a men's breakfast group that met on Saturday mornings. I rearranged the furniture in our living room, something Sarah had wanted to do, but I'd always resisted. I adopted a new rescue dog, not to replace our old one who had died a year before Sarah, but to have companionship and a reason to get out of bed in the morning. I also had to learn practical skills Sarah had always handled. She managed our finances, did the laundry, cooked most of our meals. At 68 years old, I was learning to decipher bank statements and sort whites from colors. There were disasters, like the time I turned all my white shirts pink, but each small accomplishment felt like a step forward. One of the most healing changes was starting a grief support group at our church. Using my own experience to help others gave purpose to my pain. It didn't make the grief go away, but it gave it meaning. About a year after Sarah's passing, something unexpected happened. I was in the backyard, deadheading roses in the garden she had loved, when I heard my 4-year-old granddaughter squealing with delight as she chased bubbles my son was blowing. The sound of her laughter, the sight of her little legs pumping as she ran across the grass, the warm sunshine on my face. Suddenly, I felt a surge of joy. And immediately after came crushing guilt. How could I feel joy when Sarah wasn't here to share it? Was I betraying her memory by experiencing happiness? This is something many grieving people struggle with, the guilt that accompanies those first moments of happiness after loss. A grief counselor I was seeing helped me understand that experiencing joy wasn't being unfaithful to Sarah's memory. She told me, the depth of your grief reflects the depth of your love. But so does your capacity for joy. Sarah loved you. Do you think she would want you to never experience happiness again? Of course she wouldn't. Sarah had been the most joyful person I knew. She found delight in small things, a cardinal at the bird feeder, a perfectly ripe peach, our grandchildren's artwork on the refrigerator. Allowing myself to experience joy wasn't betraying her memory. It was honoring the way she had lived. These moments of joy began to come more frequently. They didn't replace the grief. Both existed simultaneously. I could miss Sarah terribly and still laugh at a funny movie. I could wish she was beside me at our granddaughter's dance recital, while still feeling proud and happy watching the performance. Grief and joy weren't mutually exclusive. They became companions on my journey. One of the most helpful concepts I discovered in my grief journey was something therapists call continuing bonds. The old model of grief suggested that we need to let go and move on from the person who died. But more recent understanding recognizes that we don't have to sever our connection with our loved ones. Instead, we transform the relationship. Sarah is still part of my life. I talk to her sometimes when I'm alone. Like, keep her favorite sweater on the chair in my bedroom. I make her famous apple pie for family gatherings. These aren't signs that I'm stuck in grief. They're ways I maintain our bond while continuing to live my life. Our 45th wedding anniversary was approaching, and I dreaded it. How could I mark that day without her? After much thought, I decided to spend it doing things Sarah loved. I went to her favorite botanical garden, ate lunch at the cafe she enjoyed, and bought books for our grandchildren. I ended the day sitting on our porch swing, looking at our wedding album and talking to her about our life together. Was it sad? Yes, at moments. But it was also deeply meaningful. I wasn't pretending she was still physically present, but I was acknowledging that our connection continues beyond her physical absence. I've encouraged people in my grief group to find their own ways of maintaining these continuing bonds. One woman wears her husband's watch. Another plants his favorite flowers each spring. A young widower takes his children to the ice cream shop his wife loved on her birthday. These rituals acknowledge both the reality of death and the ongoing nature of love. One of the most harmful myths about grief is that it follows a predictable timeline. You may have heard about the 5 stages of grief: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. While these emotions are common in grief, they don't occur in neat, sequential stages. Grief isn't linear. 2 years after Sarah's death, I thought I was doing well. Then her birthday came around, and I was blindsided by grief that felt as fresh as the day she died. I couldn't get out of bed. I canceled my appointments. I felt like I'd gone backwards in my healing journey. My grief counselor explained that grief often works in cycles. We don't move steadily forward. We spiral through emotions, sometimes revisiting intense pain we thought we'd moved beyond. Special dates, holidays, anniversaries, even certain songs or smells can trigger these grief surges years after a loss. Understanding this non-linear nature of grief has helped me be more gentle with myself. When those intense waves come, I no longer think, "What's wrong with me? Why am I not over this yet?" Instead, I recognize this is a normal grief surge. It will pass. It doesn't mean I'm failing at grief. I've also learned that grief changes over time. The early grief was like a tsunami, overwhelming, devastating, consuming everything in its path. As time passed, my grief became more like the tide, still present, still powerful, but with a rhythm I could anticipate and navigate. There are still high tides, days when grief rises and covers everything, but they don't last forever. The tide recedes, and I can walk on the shore again. About 2.5 years after Sarah died, a young couple in our congregation lost their infant son to SIDS. They came to me, broken and questioning. As I sat with them in their pain, I realized that my own grief journey had given me a depth of understanding and compassion I couldn't have had before. I couldn't take away their pain. No one can do that. But I could sit with them in the darkness in a way I couldn't have before experiencing my own profound loss. Viktor Frankl, the psychiatrist who survived Nazi concentration camps, wrote that finding meaning in suffering is key to enduring it. While I would never choose the pain of losing Sarah, I've found meaning in using what I've learned to help others navigate their own grief journeys. I started writing about my experience. At first, it was just for myself, journaling as a way to process my thoughts and feelings. But eventually, I shaped some of those writings into a series of articles for our church newsletter. The response was overwhelming. People told me they'd never heard grief described so honestly, especially from a pastor. They said it gave them permission to acknowledge their own complex feelings of loss. This led to speaking opportunities at other churches and community organizations. I found myself becoming an advocate for more honest, nuanced conversations about grief, especially among older adults who are often expected to just stoically accept loss as part of aging. Moving forward with purpose doesn't mean leaving Sarah behind. She's part of who I am, part of what makes me able to connect with others in their pain. Her influence continues through me. 3 years after losing Sarah, I can honestly say that I've rediscovered joy. Not the same joy I had before, loss changes you forever, but a new kind of joy that is deeper because it coexists with sorrow. I still miss Sarah every day. I still talk to her picture. I still sleep on my side of the bed. But I also laugh with friends, enjoy my grandchildren, find satisfaction in my ministry, and yes, I smile again. Really smile, not just the polite facial arrangement I managed in those early days of grief. Last month, I officiated a wedding for a young couple in our church. There was a moment during the ceremony when I glanced down at my hands and noticed I wasn't wearing my wedding ring. About a year ago, I decided to move it from my finger to a chain around my neck. It wasn't a rejection of my marriage to Sarah. It was an acknowledgement that while I'll always be her husband in my heart, my hands are now free to engage with the world in new ways. As I pronounced the couple husband and wife, I felt a deep sense of gratitude for the love Sarah and I shared, alongside genuine joy for these young people beginning their journey together. In that moment, I realized how far I'd come. I wasn't just going through the motions of life anymore. I was fully present, fully engaged, experiencing the full spectrum of human emotion. Grief doesn't end. It changes. It softens. It makes room for other feelings. The theologian Henry Nouwen described this transformation as grief becoming mourning, a sadness that's integrated into our lives rather than consuming them. That resonates with my experience. The sharp, jagged edges of early grief have been worn smooth, like sea glass tumbled by the waves. The grief is still there, but it no longer cuts me with every movement. As I reflect on these past 3 years, the hardest of my life, I'm struck by how grief has changed me. I'm more patient with others' pain. I'm less certain about easy answers. I'm more present in each moment. I'm less concerned with trivial matters. Grief has been a harsh but effective teacher. If you're in the early stages of grief right now, please hear me. What you're feeling is normal. The disorientation, the physical symptoms, the feeling that you'll never be happy again, these are all common experiences in grief. And while everyone's journey is different, I can tell you that the acute pain does change over time. Don't let anyone rush your grief or tell you how you should be feeling. There's no timeline, no right way to grieve. Be gentle with yourself. Accept help when it's offered. Find people who can sit with you in your pain without trying to fix it. And if you're further along in your grief journey, I hope my story resonates with your experience. Perhaps you've already discovered that joy and sorrow can coexist, that moving forward doesn't mean forgetting, that life can be meaningful even after devastating loss. If this video has helped you feel less alone in your grief journey, please consider subscribing to this channel for more content on navigating loss, especially for those of us in our later years. Share it with someone who might be struggling. Leave a comment about your own experience. Your story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today. I thought I'd never smile again after losing Sarah. I was wrong. And if you're thinking the same thing right now, I hope my journey gives you a glimmer of hope that joy can return to your life too. Not the same joy as before, grief changes us forever, but a new joy, deeper and more precious, because we know firsthand how fragile and precious life truly is. Thank you for listening to my story. May you find peace and healing on your own grief journey.